Right, good. I was going to say good afternoon, good morning, everyone. It's been a long day. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session with Professor Barry Carpenter on Happy, Sad, Scared Revisited, promoting positive mental health in children and young people. And I've had the pleasure of sitting in with Barry when he ran this not an hour ago. So I'm sure we're in for a good session. I'm just admitting people as I go along and trying to multitask, which I always find difficult. Yeah, great to see you all here. Barry will do his presentation. He's got a slideshow. Because it's Zoom, it will automatically be recorded. So at the end, we can send around the recording to people, and we can turn around the slides as well. We've got a chat function. If you look at the bottom of the screen, just below Barry's cardigan there, you'll see a little chat function with the speech bubble. If you click on that, please ask questions as Barry goes along, because it's a fantastic presentation. I don't want to stop his flow. But at the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions, thoughts, and reflections. So if there's something that occurs to you as Barry's going along, do pop up in the chat, and then we can unmute you at the end. We'll have 10-15 minutes for you to go through that. And as I say, we'll share everything with you at the end. Don't worry on that score if you miss anything, or if your internet connection goes a little bit wobbly. But time is of the essence, so I shall let Barry get on with his presentation again, and I'll leave the floor to him. Barry, over to you.
I'll go through the screen share then, Andy, and bring it all up. Okay. Let's go to the first slide. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and it's quite a turnout for this second session. When we first conceived this particular topic, it was well before the pandemic that NHT first asked if I would speak, and I chose to use the term happy, sad and scared because 2 years ago, perhaps 3, my colleague Dr. Francesca Happe actually addressed the NHT Special Needs Conference then and gave a keynote which she called Happy, Sad and Scared, and the last of those words, scared, always made me somewhat curious. And yet as I've watched this pandemic unfold, I think my understanding of what scared means in children of all abilities has deepened. And the work that I've been doing during this pandemic period has shown me that there are some very deep issues for some of our children that we're going to need to help them through very creative teaching resolve in the coming months, maybe even in the coming years. I was part of a dialogue yesterday with the NHS and with the clinical lead there for child mental health, Professor Chitsaban, and I've been doing some leading work for the DFE around child mental health because of the nature of my professorship at the moment. And one of the issues that's coming out from psychiatrist colleagues is about the toxic stress. Because children are so scared and anxious and worried, that there is this underlying stress that's constantly with them that's becoming toxic. And what the psychiatrists are saying is that's now having a neurobiological effect. Basically, if it's neurobiological, it's impacting on the child, who isn't just a growing child in physical terms. The brain is also a growing organ, and they're worried about some of the compounding effects. Certainly, and lots of you know that my major piece of research in recent years has been the complex needs work when I was National Director for DFE. And one of the major concerns from that piece of work was that the complex need that most alters the developmental trajectory of any child is mental health. And we are certainly seeing a rise in the child mental health issues. And there seems to be this cumulative multiplicity of adverse life influences at the moment, some of which we could never have comprehended. So putting the negatives now in their place, let's focus on how we might promote positive mental health in our children and young people. And to do that, I want to start with a concept of mental wealth. You know, when we talk about mental health, colleagues, actually what we mean is mental ill health. Mental health is also a diagnostic. We are not diagnosticians. we are teachers, we are school leaders. We often act on information given to us by medical colleagues in terms of a diagnosis of a disability, for example. But ultimately, our job is not medical interventions. Our job is to promote a learning process. One of the questions I think we need to be asking more is always, and what is the impact of that child's disability, that child's special needs, on their learning pathways? Are there medical reasons why they may do this and not do that? Those are questions to ask, because that influences the shape of our teaching and learning. But ultimately, what we're trying to do then is to create mental wealth in our children. It was a tough world out there. It's an even tougher world out there now. And who knows what the world yet to come is going to be like for our children and young people. To comprehend what is happening around us is difficult for any of us at the moment. With all that we're hearing day in, day out, what sense must some of our children with significant learning disabilities be making of this current situation? So it's about the mental wealth, the treasure that we can give children. And so what is it? Is it this? Is it about the meaningful friendships that we can create? Or this, the strong bonds that we can value, the families that we can value as part of our school community? Or is it this, when a child really deeply engages in a learning activity and the sense of fascination, of awe, of wonder? Or is it this, when a child gets so deeply engrossed in an activity? I would imagine if you said to this little girl, it's time to pack away now, we need to join the lunch queue, you'd turn around 2 minutes later and she'd still be engrossed in her books. She's not being disobedient, she's not being naughty, she's just totally absorbed in that learning moment. And those are moments to treasure. Because actually the impact there is not just a learning gain for her, it's that feel-good factor. And that feel-good factor, there's all sorts of chemicals that feed up to our brain. And this affirms in the brain the positivity of learning as a contributor to positive mental health. If you looked at this chart here very simply, think of just one child who is on your mind at the moment, just one. And where would you rate that child on this simple scale? And I want you to hold that as we go through this presentation, because obviously I've chosen certain slides and certain topics for clear reasons in my head. But the best way of making sure that what's in my head makes any sense to you is for you to corroborate it against the lived experience you're seeing some of your children go through. Because my guess is that you're worried at the moment about some of the sadness in your children. That, my guess again is, that your school is not quite the happy place that it was prior to this pandemic. You're doing a good job. You're restoring those things. But there's always that sense of caution of the new rules, that for some of our children, those new rules are very confusing. Some of our autistic children just have not comprehended why that area that they used to love so much to play in is now cordoned off. And why can't they just wander freely up to that other class and visit a friend that's up there? So where are your children at on this scale? Because colleagues, you have treasure in your hands. Treasure that can transform lives. And I would ask you to invest it wisely. Invest it wisely. You see, there is a real power in teaching. There are gifts each day that your teaching workforce is giving to the children that are enabling them to live better lives, not just for today, but for lots of tomorrows, for their future. I'm constantly reminded when I look at my middle child, Katie, my daughter with Down syndrome, that she lives in her own home, that she copes with some of the routines of daily life, because teachers believed in her need to read in a particular way, which certainly wasn't through phonics, teachers believed in her ability that enabled her to go on and have the success in life, the independence she has in life. And I know that is because teachers invested their treasure, their teaching treasure, in her. And cumulatively, that treasure has transformed her life. And you can do that for so many children that are in your care. You can lift the black cloud that lurks over some of your children at the moment. You can bring joy to the lives of so many of your children. That joy will counter the scared, the fear. You can give meaning to their day. You can restore the routines and the structures that many have been sad that they lost due to the lockdown. You can give purpose to their lives. Just the very fact they come to a welcoming school community such as yours. You encourage them on their way, enabling them to be the best that they can be. And you're that never-failing support. Yes, you give them independence, but when they fall, you catch them. In the words of late Caroline Flack, in a world where you can be anything, be kind. At this moment, and as I say, we started to design this presentation before the pandemic, but I think it has to be set in this moment. We all know what has been, but we don't truly know what is yet to come and what it will be. But we know there are certain principles by which we can live our lives and by which we can deliver our teaching responsibilities to our school and our children, and our leadership responsibilities to our teaching and broader workforce. And key to our leadership has to be kindness. Through kindness we display compassionate leadership. Leadership with understanding of the human condition. So much of this presentation is going to be based around the recovery curriculum, which I would imagine the majority of you have read. If you haven't, it's on the recovery curriculum website. There are also 15 podcasts on the recovery curriculum made by school leaders, leaders of academy chains, excellent classroom practitioners with lots of resource ideas. There's an excellent one by a school governor, chair of school governors, Polly Meakin, who was in her former life a special school head. She's now chair of governors of a primary school. So if you feel your governing body, for example, is out of the cycle of debate and discussion, then you might want to share that with your governing body as a way of refreshing them, because I think governors have felt very disorientated by this experience and how they discharge their duties meaningfully to support both you and your staff team. There's also a Facebook page linked to Recovery Curriculum. People tell me, I don't do Facebook, people tell me there's about 12,000 followers on there, and the resources on there are really wonderful. There's a LinkedIn group as well. So the recovery curriculum is a construct. I get people email me saying, can we buy it? No, it's just a way of thinking. It's a construct. And my son Matthew and I wrote the recovery curriculum. Matthew, as you saw on the previous slide, is principal now of Baxter College, which is a secondary academy. And we chose the word construct because it's part of that broader word construction. And this is about constructing a curriculum of this moment that wraps around your children, that envelops this diverse range of needs that you always have, you may say, but there are more. Be honest, there are more. There are more configurations of complexity of need. In fact, I've just written a piece now where I'm talking about compounded complexity. You thought you had children with complex needs in your school, and indeed you do. Can I just say that the current context, and particularly the mental health, the rapid erosion in mental health, in children per se, is actually compounding complexity, and therefore compassionate leadership and a culture of kindness is key to the work of your school. And to know that at times as leaders, it can be about best informed judgments. Teaching is an evidence-based profession. We don't have an evidence base for some of the judgments that we're having to make. You saw that surely with our health colleagues at the start of the pandemic. They were flailing around, working hard, but they didn't have the precision of medicine that they were used to. The response is now, and even though the death toll is rising, it's managed more effectively than it was at the early onset of this pandemic. All the time we're seeking that personalised response. I did a webinar last night for the Education Development Trust, and some of you may already be part of their peer mentoring scheme. It struck me as a really dynamic process, and this schools partnership programme that they have. And they have, unbeknown to myself and Matthew, they took the recovery curriculum, put it through a peer mentoring process and a process of scrutiny and inquiry, which in effect has evolved through that process an evidence base that supports the efficacy of the recovery curriculum and corroborates the hypotheses, because a lot of my writing then, I'll confess, was best judgment based on 40 years of working in our field of what would be happening to the children. That was my primary concern. How is this going to affect the children? And I articulate that process of recovery, but Matthew, my son, said to me only a few weeks back, Dad, I don't feel like we're in recovery yet. We're still reconnecting and rejoining as a school community. And that's come through the work of the Education Development Trust. And in fact, they feel we're going through this, when we joined our schools together in September, of reflecting and reimagining what our school community would be. Again, in this moment, let's be honest, long-term planning cannot really be in the daily visioning of our schools at the moment. It's a survival of each day. And how many of us will be there at the end of a day that were there at the start of a day? Therefore, moving into rebalancing and reconnecting, most certainly, reconnecting the relationships, the groupings of our school. Rebalancing, because the organisation of our school is different. You move up one corridor this way and down this corridor another way. And this group goes out and that group stays in, and so on. So the pandemic is still with us. Coronavirus is still with us. We have the joyful news of a vaccine, but that's going to take a while to get this awful virus under control. So whilst the illness remains, we cannot recover from the illness. This is going to be a much more extended process than ever I imagined at the beginning, and I guess that you imagined. This is going to go on for some time. So Amanda Spielman has been talking about rebuilding our schools. People are anxious about the work of Ofsted this term, but I'm old enough to have remembered a world of education where we didn't have Ofsted. I was HMI myself for 5 years in those days, and our job was monitoring national trends, and that's what HMI have been doing this term. We need to know what's happening in our schools to our children, and in order to do that, visits to schools had to be made. And I'm going to use some of the Ofsted evidence from those 900 visits a little further on in this presentation. But Amanda Spielman is saying decisions about what we do in our schools should be based on the needs of each child. Well, that's manna from heaven for the type of work that we do. That's what we do anyway. But to hear it from Her Majesty's Chief Inspector affirms the approaches we need to take. Within the recovery curriculum, then, there are 5 losses. For some of our children, that loss of routine, getting on the school bus each day, or getting their things ready to bring to school, and then the fact you have a timetable so that their day is structured, those things went when we went into lockdown. And it spiraled some of our children into feelings of sadness. They were scared. I know parents, particularly of children with autism, who had to weekly drive past the school to reassure their son or daughter that the school was still there. And that loss of friendship, whatever children I've interviewed, and I've been doing various pieces of work during the pandemic, whether I've had Zoom calls, whether I've gone into social distance meetings with groups of children, from 4-year-olds to 14-year-olds, they've talked about the loss of friendship. It's been really significant. I would say for some children, they've gone through what the literature would call a process of prolonged mourning, where they've mourned for the loss of their friendship group. And a loss of opportunity. You only had to talk to a GCSE or A-level student last year to know how significant that loss of opportunity was. But there have been lots of opportunities for our children too. What about our leavers in July? We did our best with transitions, but it wasn't what we would normally have done. There's no criticism there. It was what it was. But we knew that we hadn't prepared some of our young people as well as we might. And indeed, where was the progression there? I know of many people with disabilities at the moment who would normally be in a college situation, but because, particularly in this last lockdown, people with Down syndrome, for example, have been put into the extremely vulnerable group, which means they can't go out into college situations. And you try explaining this loss of opportunity to some of them, it's just impossible. And again, I'm talking from first-hand experience. And that loss of freedom, oh my, for some of our children, that loss of freedom was a very destructive thing. They're used to the wonderful environment, the stimulating environment you've worked so hard to create in your schools, and it wasn't stuck home with. That word regression has appeared in the report that Ofsted have just published about the 900 visits they made. And what I've done is analysed the Ofsted report and applied it now against those 5 losses you've just seen. So in terms of routine, there was regression. For example, in toilet training, children that were toilet trained have gone back into nappies. A loss of structure. Children that had pencil grip, a tripod grip, have either gone back to a palmar grip or just do not grip a pencil anymore. There's been a loss of motoric skill, a loss of fine motor skill. Children that could hold a knife and fork do not feed themselves in that way anymore. And sure enough, that loss of friendship came through powerfully. The loss of social interaction, which for our children has often meant a regression in communication skills also. One head teacher giving evidence to Ofsted spoke of going into the nursery class attached to his school, and children were playing in silence. That's not what you normally observe with 3-4-year-olds. But children playing in silence, they'd gone back to solitary play because that's what they did at home. They weren't at those phases of associative or cooperative play. And the loss of opportunity has given rise to mental distress of children of all abilities. And the 2 spikes that are appearing nationally at the moment in erosion of children's mental health are self-harm and eating disorders. Those, and the age profile that those are occurring has dropped. They are coming through now in children in years 5 and 6. Self-harm has been powered by this relentless access to social media and to technology. You know, we've asked children to learn online, therefore they've had to have access to laptops and computers. Well, with some of our mainstream children, if it's a year 6 child doing a creative writing task, they don't need mom and dad sitting by them throughout all of that, but then they've been nipping onto other websites when mum and dad haven't been there. They've been going onto the dark web and watching the videos of how you cut yourself. One of the latest little tricks is to cut yourself in such a way that it drips into a little vial bottle. You put a ribbon on it and give it to your friend as a sign of undying friendship. And eating disorders. My youngest daughter, Grace, is a child mental health lead, occupational therapist by background, in our region, and she returned from maternity leave and within 10 days was asked by her bosses to move from her normal caseload of GP liaison to acting head of eating disorders. CAMS are overwhelmed with eating disorders. I think the figure I heard from the NHS yesterday, increase in with these colleagues. They cannot suddenly magic staff with the right skill set. And my daughter has just an analysis of her caseload and discovered that in fact this time there's 48% of her caseload who are boys with eating disorders. Well, what does that look like? And it doesn't look like eating disorders in girls. Boys with eating disorders are on those protein shakes, bulking up, forgetting to eat. By the time it's discovered, they're on the verge of organ failure and death. So there are many things that our CAMS colleagues are having to deal with that are new manifestations of mental health need that we did not see either in this volume or in this form prior to this pandemic. We're all having to acquire new professional skills, and indeed there's going to have to be an extension to our teaching repertoire to deal with this ever diverse mental health dimension to our children and young people. And a loss of freedom is the last one. Ofsted have observed a loss of stamina in our children. Children can't actually get through a lesson without becoming exhausted. And that'll be for some of our children because they'll have had a loss of physical activity as well. They've probably, some of our more fragile children, had to be kept in the home, not even out on the daily walk. So we need to be thinking about the pitch and pace of lesson delivery. Maybe we do 15 minutes of literacy and then a 5-minute sensory activity, another 15 minutes of literacy, and then do a standing on the spot imitation physical fitness activity, and try and pace our lessons in that way. So we're constantly giving opportunities for emotional regulation as well as for learning progression in other domains. So what are the actual figures? Well, if you'd have asked me in January about children per se, how many children have a mental health issue, we were still working to the figure of 1 in 9. Already, at this point in this pandemic, it's 1 in 6, and we're not over this yet. And this is about mainstream, neurotypical children. So how does that roll out for us in special needs? Because we know, again, we don't have figures at the moment on SEND, so all I can do is apply what we had before. And before, for every 5 children on SEN register, 3 would have a mental health problem. So what is it now? Well, it's certainly not 3. Before, for every 10 children with autism in the teenage years, 7 would have a mental health issue. So what is it now? Well, it's certainly not 7. So, all of that should be enough impetus for you to know that SEMH domain, social, emotional, mental health, that we have in the HCPs has to now become a dominant curriculum area in our schools. It's going to be anyway, because with the Rochford Review recommendations coming into force legally from next September, the HCP will become the curriculum driver in schools like ours. But we've got, as Professor Chitsaban here says, she's taking the lead for NHS, and just last week she and I had quite an extensive conversation. She collaborates very well. She's seeing anxiety, sadness and loneliness coming through, and some of our children with disabilities, because the very nature of that disability, when we put them into lockdown, they couldn't have contact with many other people at all, and experienced great levels of loneliness because people they weren't seeing the churn of social interaction that they would normally experience in their daily lives. All of these things have led to what I would call 4 consequences. Bereavement, at 2 levels bereavement. There's been the direct grief, because you cannot lose nearly 60,000 people in your country without it being some child's grandparent, some child's aunt or uncle, or the next door neighbour, or that nice person in the street who was an NHS frontline worker and lost their life. So there's direct grief, but then there's also that prolonged mourning that I talked about, that the mourning experience they had for the loss of their friendship group, for example. And some children, I think, are carrying bereavement responses because from that day in March that we had to close our schools, there was a severing of the relationship with that teacher at that point. And maybe they've now returned in September to a different teacher. And that old relationship has never had closure, it's never been healed. And maybe once things get back to a nearer normal, we might consider how we heal those broken relationships. Because I know we gave explanations as best we could to our children, but we were all running around too, putting things in boxes and bags to send home for home learning. Did we say, well, we didn't think we were saying goodbye. We didn't know how long this was going to go on for. So there are all sorts of dimensions, if you like, of grief, I think, existing in some of our children. And attachment, most certainly. When we broke the bonds back in March with our children, the bonds of attachment were broken and have not actually been restored. We need to be mindful of that. Anxiety I've already touched on, but anxiety is a very major feature for our children. And I'm going to talk particularly about anxiety on the next few slides. But all of those, bereavement, attachment, anxiety, they're all traumas. We know that trauma in childhood that goes unprocessed comes back to bite that person in adulthood. Unfulfilled potential, unfulfilled realization of earning potential, for example, an inability to sustain meaningful relationships, reduced social interactions. And all of those things are relevant in the lives of the range of young people with special needs and disabilities represented in the audience today. Barnardo's have reported a 44% increase in the number of children going into care. There's a link there with, and you've all heard on the news, the rise in domestic violence, the rise in alcohol consumption. Supermarket returns tell us that the sales of alcohol has gone up. Children will have witnessed domestic violence in the home, and therefore some children have gone into care. We know historically that children with special needs and disabilities are a higher percentage group within the care system. So whilst I cannot tell you what percentage of that 44 are children with special needs and disabilities, it is a fair assumption, a best judgment, that there will be a considerable number of children with special needs and disabilities where the pressures of caring for that child with a disability have just become too much within the dynamics of some families. But we're teachers, and I can listen to all of this medical stuff and understand it as best I can. But at the end of the day, I want to know, how does any of that impact on the learning abilities of the child that's in my class, of the children in the school for which I am the school leader? And my assessment at the moment is the impact on learning for our children is that they are frail, fragile and fragmented. They are frail in their belief in themselves as an efficient and effective learner. What Laura Purser in a very useful article calls self-efficacy, and I've posted that article on my website, that self-belief, that self-confidence as a learner. They know that they've lost certain things. Let's be brutally honest, they were never the best ones at remembering things. For some of our children, particularly those with FASD, are what I would call here today, gone tomorrow learners. Did it beautifully for you one day, and the next day they looked at you as if you'd never taught that. They're fragile. Those neural pathways that carry the messages across the brain have gone through being scared, fear. The New Minded definition of adverse childhood experiences doesn't just talk fight and flight, it talks fight, flight and fear. If neural pathways have experienced fear, they become sluggish or frozen. What we need to do is be doing some teaching that stimulates new neural pathway growth. The easiest way to do that is to do an activity based around imitation. Imitation will stimulate new neural pathway growth, and that in turn will kickstart the sluggish neural pathways, the message transmitters, in the other parts of the brain. Yes, I probably am calling for a universal revival of Simon Says, but it's low cost, no cost. It's no hassle. Unless you tell me we've become a perfect profession, we're all searching for the 5-minute fill-in because the lessons finished slightly early. And fragmented. Parents did a magnificent job during lockdown. They have taught the best that they could in the majority of cases. But you know that that's not the interconnected, integrated learning that child would have experienced had they been in the classroom with you. So they've come back with these fragments that you're trying to give some coherence and cohesion to. And you've got spiky profiles of learning, therefore. So the psychiatrists are talking about lockdown anxiety. And again, we can only understand that by applying what we knew previously. We can understand that the lockdown has raised the levels of anxiety. And we know that when those levels of anxiety rise, cortisol in the brain rises. If it rises to the surface of the brain, it actually blocks the memory imprint. So you could have just taught the most marvellous literacy lesson, but if I was passing by as the children coming out of your lesson and said to a child, what have you just learnt in literacy? They might say, don't know. They're not being rude, but actually, whilst you thought they were quiet and attentive, they were actually rigid with fear and masking a series of learning behaviours that led you to believe that they were engaged, and in fact they weren't. let's remind ourselves that the anxious child is not a learning child. So what are you doing to reduce anxiety in your classroom? What are you doing to regulate anxiety? To just know that it's there. And therefore, for teaching one thing for a long period of time is you're going to lose the children. So what are we putting in that's about emotional regulation, as I mentioned earlier, after about 15 minutes for some children and so on. And again, 15 minutes is arbitrary, isn't it? Because it's going to be so variable in the child population that's represented amongst you all. There are 5 levers in the recovery curriculum, and my son Matthew is particularly responsible for the development of these. And the first lever is about relationships. We cannot tell each other enough, adult or child, it's really good to see you. Because when you say that, we affirm that we are survivors, and 60,000 people in our country are not. But it's those relationships that make schools like yours the wonderful places that they are. Are tarnished, some of those relationships are full of fear. Some of your staff are carrying sadness because they too have lost someone during this pandemic period. And the rebuilding of your community, does it now very much involve those parents? Colleagues, this is the best chance we've had in 2 decades to get meat on the bones of what we mean by partnership with parents. Because some of the assessment processes we've had to use have disengaged some parents. They've not comprehended what we've been saying. So we need to be engaging and listening. Some parents will be wanting to know how their child is doing. That could be to do with their own anxiety about active in the community. It could be about they formed a very because they now understand better what it is that you're teaching. And in fact, their respect and admiration for you has grown. So let's continue to grow together based on shared understanding, shared commitment to the child as a learner. And particularly with children such as yours, we cannot assume that the learning skills they had prior to lockdown, they've got now. So we need to go back and explicitly scaffold our teaching, explicitly pull out the learning skills that children need to be efficient and effective. And a transparent curriculum, how much of what we're doing is co-created, co-constructed with the children? I know you've got children with a range of communication difficulties, but you also know you've given them a range of pathways through which they can express their ideas and opinions. My son actually interviewed his student parliament via Zoom in July to plan for the September return. And he asked them, what do you want from your teachers when you come back in September? And from year 7 to year 12, the representative said, we want somebody who will explain to us what's COVID-19, what's a pandemic, why has it gone global, why is coronavirus still with us? Those are not unreasonable questions from a child. They want to learn, and we are teachers. And I know you have children with particular difficulties, but those questions in some form or other lurk within them. So my question to your teaching force is, have they taught that lesson yet? Have they found the medium through which to do it? I'll give you some examples later. And finally, space. Space to be, to rediscover their self-image, their self-confidence, their self-esteem. Whether that be external space or internal space. And again, I have a suggestion as we go a little further. So what would a recovery curriculum look like? This is from Churchwood School, School for Children with Autism. And Claire Owens, the assistant head there, has made a wonderful podcast that you'll find on the recovery curriculum. And she talks about the recovery curriculum being about emotional resilience, making the children as strong as they can be emotionally. Self-regulation, absolutely. We'll sink under this tsunami of mental health need if we don't encourage our children to self-regulate. And again, learning how to learn, because some of that will have been lost. As Ofsted said, there has been regression. How do we keep our children emotionally strong? And I'm deliberately using a picture of exercise here, because we know when there's positive exercise, there's an endorphin release. This is more than PE. We need to be using exercise intervention for individuals and for our class groups. Maybe you're noticing you can't get the children the same length of lesson they used to. So maybe we're interspersing some exercise during a lesson to help that self-regulation and to rebuild the physical fitness, the stamina emotionally to get through a lesson. I've been coaching Victoria Wells from the Youth Sports Trust in this think piece that She's just published on my website and on the Recovery Curriculum website. And she talks about physical activities and talks about stimulating vestibular and proprioceptive senses, and talks about creating sport. It implies peace, it implies an opportunity to co-create with the child, and picking up a range of activities. Do have a look at the piece that's on my website. I think you'll find the idea very interesting. So there are phases of the recovery curriculum. It's holistic, it's for everyone, it's for all. It's focused recovery for some children. We need those personalised responses for some of our children and young people. And for some, we need deep recovery. We need a longer period of exploration because of the depth of trauma that some of our children and young people will have gone through. One of the commissions I had during lockdown was an invitation to write 2 children's books, and I'd never written children's books before, so I really enjoyed this opportunity. And I worked with 2 colleagues, Alison and Jenny from Whitfield Aspen School, which is a very inclusive school, special and primary school combined in Dover, and it works really very well, and they helped with the trials of the developments of the books in the school. We worked with the artist Charlotte Furman, whose father Peter did things like the clangers, Bagpuss, and so on. And these books are now free to download. I was very anxious that every child should have access to them, and so I fundraised for the £12,000 production costs and gave it to the publisher, and so you can now access them free. Although there's been requests for hard copies, and so the publisher's now selling bundles fairly cheaply of the books, so that for some children they need that sort of static medium to work with. And as you'll see, they're wordless books, because this isn't about literacy, colleagues. This is about emotional literacy. This is about children being able to express, through whatever means, signs, symbols, voice-activated devices, their feelings. And just looking at that picture on the left, I mean, for me that's a very real one. I well remember leaving a present on the doorstep of one of my grandchildren for their birthday, and the sensation of not being able to hug them, not being part of the interaction on their day of celebration. Head teachers are telling me now, several months since these were published on September 1st, that in fact children are going back to the books now, and now they tell the story of their life in lockdown, or share the feelings of how they felt when they returned to school. So I'm sure some of you have already got these, but if you haven't, please just get them. They're a free resource. I love this picture which one head teacher sent me of these are 2 sisters, but they'd had to go into self-isolation due to positive COVID testing. And here they are at home. The books were sent home. You know, I'm sure again you're sending home resources or having stuff online when children have to self-isolate. And what are we offering them that is about their emotional well-being? And these are wordless books, and what we've recently done is a major study over 2 years across special schools, looking at how the Books Beyond Words can resource social, emotional, mental health in the curriculum. And we've had 95% ratings plus, where teachers are saying pupils now verbalise or show by some other means of communication how they're feeling, whereas previously they've only shown it through their behaviour. I mentioned earlier domestic violence. So for example, there's a book in the Books Beyond Words series called When Dad Hurts Mom. Not a whole class book, but it may be for one child in your class a relevant book to share, and that's something the teaching assistant, for example, could go through with a child. And if you haven't seen this, please get it for the children in your school. It's a free pamphlet, again through Books Beyond Words, about going for the test. Now, we're sending children out for tests. Have you seen the size of those swabs they put down their throat and up their nose? For some children, that'll freak them out. Why would we put them in that situation when we can have taught it in our classrooms? This book is downloadable. It goes on a whiteboard. it would just enable you. There's no words to limit it. You can use whatever words, signs, symbols, whatever, to explain this to your children. You can print it off and send it with the parents when the child's going for the test, so it can visually clue and cue the child during that anxiety-raising process. Other resources I recommend are from Nurture UK. This is the bereavement box. Again, I've talked about grief. And this bereavement box has got 60 laminated cards in it, in the same format as this next box. We like laminated, don't we, colleagues, for all sorts of bodily function reasons. And now, because of a coronavirus, we like laminated. This box, 60 sensory minutes, absolutely ideal for our PMLD learners, but also our pupils of all abilities with autism, because it helps that self-regulation of sensory overload. There are other boxes in the Nurture UK, which is a charity anyway, repertoire, so do have a look at them. That last box on the sensory minutes, I use it for a study that I've just completed around children with attachment issues, where in a local special school, the head rang me and said that her children with attachment or who were in care were functioning 29% below their peer group. And what was the pedagogy for intervention? Well, there isn't one automatically for children with attachment issues. There is if it's ADHD or autism. So she invited me to do a school-based study with 2 of her teachers, and so for 3 sessions a week we had children whose EHCPs indicated that they had attachment issues or similar. And we use the Evidence for Learning app, which is, for those of you who know it, can be video based. We took 3-minute video clips. When we came to analyse them at the end of the first term, normally I'd have had observational notes and it would have taken me a week to analyse the threads that were emerging. But the video based, I did it in a morning. And what emerged was that the activities that had an imitation component were the most successful. And also teachers reported, class teachers reported, they were the ones that were transferring most sustainably back into the classroom. Now, colleagues, it's blindingly obvious, because imitation, Piaget said, imitation is the basis of all learning. I used to love it when I was teaching Mackerton to children. They started to make the sign. Not that they were just making the sign for house or car or cup, but in fact, what did that tell me? It told me those neural pathways were clear, that they were looking at my hand, sending messages up to the brain. The brain was decoding and encoding, sending messages down the neural pathway, and their hands were shaping into that sign, however crudely. And that was magnificent, because avenue pandemic, that imitation will liberate that look. The teenage years, and it covers some really difficult stuff, but in child speak. The language is already there. Yes, you'll need to modify it a bit further probably, but so what's new? So it deals with things like body image and eating disorder and keeping safe online and using social media and relaxing and building your resilience and challenging negative thoughts and so on. An excellent resource, so do have a look at that. These journals are from Butterfly Print. I've done a couple of research projects using these. You can see they're divided into key stages. Well, that's not going to apply in your context, but the ideas and activities in there are just superb. This company will now sell single copies to parents. They've removed postage and packing. There's a discount code there, MH Post. You'll find the activities in there are really helpful. And again, When you're sending children home for 2 weeks of self-isolation, it means you've got something tangible you could send back that is about their emotional well-being that parents could work on. This has been produced during the pandemic by a teacher of PSHE, Di Hamill. When she sent me a copy, I encouraged her to publish it more widely, which Butterfly Print have done. And it's something of this moment. It's something to chart the journey of walking through this coronavirus period, of articulating those emotions, which for some of our children is so necessary, because otherwise they'll carry the trauma of those emotions with them. The publisher's selling these very cheap and cheerfully because it's something of the moment. It's something to use now. One of the best resources out there is this book from Tina Ray. Tina and I have worked quite closely during the pandemic, and she's written this in response to recovery curriculum with all the strategies, activities that you could need. Very easy to adapt for children with special needs. In fact, some of them are written for children with special needs. And she helps with that pitch and pace in lessons that I've talked about earlier. This is again from a special education from Forest Oak School in Solihull. Amanda Mordy, the executive principal there, developed this with her team as a response to the NHS 5 Ways to Wellbeing. So SMILE is actually in child speak the 5 ways to well-being, such as being active, connecting, and so on. We've then just completed, prior to the pandemic kicking in, a trial across 20 schools, primary and special. And the evidence that came back was that it's an ethos-based approach, so it's not about going out and buying a new program, abandoning what you've currently got. It's about framing probably a diverse range of things you've got that support emotional well-being into what is called SMILE. Amanda's made a podcast which is on the Recovery Curriculum website. And we need to think about engagement at this time. You would expect me to say that, wouldn't you? But I'm worried about the number of children that are disengaged, that got switched off during lockdown, that feel disenfranchised from your school community, that feel disaffected by the curriculum that's on offer in normal circumstances. And we need to liberate that intrinsic motivation through those processes of engagement that we know are so dynamic, because it is and remains the single best predictor for successful learning. It is the lens that will help us penetrate the mask that many of our children are displaying at the moment, because they are scared and sad and worried and anxious. So with my colleagues Joe Edgerton and Bev Cobill, we've gone through the Engagement for Learning website. We've re-standardised everything so that it fits with the Rochford models. Now is the time for some in-class CPD, because let's remind ourselves that from September 2021, engagement becomes statutory summative assessment for those children not engaged in subject-specific learning. If anybody else tells me it's just about children that are P1 to 4, I will publicly scream from the highest mountain. That's one way of translating it, but it's about a wider group of children. What was all that work that I did about complex needs, and that we have a new generation of children about? We've now got an opportunity with Rochford to actually take it forward to a statutory summative assessment model, building on the engagement pedagogy that I developed when I was working at the DFE, that responded to the learning needs of this new 21st century population, not the P-level group of the published work of 1998, but the children that have come into our school system since. This is a responsive profile to the needs of that new generation of children. So start using it now for baselining, for looking at interventions, for those children that your staff are worried about, that are disengaged. And the byproduct of that is staff will get more familiar with using the profile, because we're taking our children at the moment on a journey. Because some are disengaged, we need to re-engage them. And at first that'll be fleeting engagement, building it up to more sustained engagement, and full, deep engagement. That flow of learning is re-established. What are the ways forward? As I said, it's hard to think about going forward, but teachers are saying to me already, I'm worried that when this is over, we'll lose the values that the recovery curriculum has engendered in our school. Well, can I commend to you the RSHE work from DFE? I wasn't directly involved in the writing of this, but I worked with DFE because they wanted to bring this forward and launched it for them in early July with a big online conference to about 600 people and 6,000 people, and they talk about mental well-being, relationships, and from further conversations with DFE, they're now minded and have commissioned the work that will extend the RSHE curriculum to pupils with SEND. And I think you'll find a compatibility with what the recovery curriculum has said with what. When I launched it, I talked about it being the heart of the curriculum, and DFE wrote to me 2 weeks ago and said they've decided now in their publicity of the new curriculum framework that they're using that term heart. The heart of the curriculum, yes, it sits across a core that may be literacy, numeracy, sensory, whatever you have is your core, but your curriculum doesn't need just core, it needs heart. Colleagues, if I boiled down all of the research on mental health and children, it comes down to two things. What makes us happy, what makes us sad? Now, when you're sad, you had a bad day at school, you go home and you know it's not the right thing to kick the dog. It's better that you put the lead on the dog, walk the dog. It's better for you and the dog, and you regulate your emotion that way. Or you play some loud music, Beethoven or rock, whatever it may be. You know how to regulate. Do our children know how to regulate? We talk about you pulling on your inner strength, and I am in awe of head teachers during this pandemic because you are doing things you were never trained for. You're doing things that 12 months ago, if somebody said to do that, we'd have laughed. We wouldn't have thought that such things were possible. Hand sanitizers everywhere, masks. But we need to articulate what we know is inner strength into tangible ways for our children to understand what that means too. So what about a happiness box? One of the things I've done with Bev Coble is to write a 2-page rationale for a happiness box. I've written on one side the research, and Bev's done a Blue Peter guide to making a happiness box. I think every child should have a happiness box at this point in time. I love the moment when they come to you and sign Happy Box, because they're telling you, if you let me work with my happiness box, which the perceptive amongst you will have realised is a glorified shoe band, and the children's and is masking the attainment and achievement things that are going to prepare him for his life or her for her life. And I want to ask you, was any of that to do with their mental health? Because teaching is a relationship-based profession, because school is a place, education is a process, and teachers, educators are people. And therefore we are that relationship-based profession. I'm old enough to think that we are a vocation. And I want you to ask yourself, what is it that called you to be a teacher? And even more so because of who you are and where you work. I want you to ask yourself, what is it that called you to work with society's most vulnerable children? And please don't walk away from that question. Answer it. Because unless you can, you'll be of no use to your children at this point in time, when their very humanity is under threat. You see, when your children came back to school in September, they didn't read your fancy name label. Most of them couldn't read your fancy name label. They looked into your eyes and they searched for the empathetic human being that lurked there. When they found that empathetic human being, they offered you their trust and loyalty. And when they offered you that, then, oh boy, could you teach, and your staff could teach. And that's when you began to invest your treasure. The treasure that I said earlier you have in your hands. That is when you began to create the mental wealth in your children and to rebuild their emotional resilience that had been so damaged by this pandemic. And just a word for you and for your staff. Colleagues, these are tough times, but we must have hope and optimism. This will end tomorrow, but it will end. You've been through tough stuff before. Draw on those positive skills and resilience to get you through. And remember that you're a wonderful human being and that your humanity has power, and you have chosen to work in that relationship-based profession we call teaching. As Desmond Tutu says, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. Thank you, colleagues, for listening today. Thank you.